The horsemen appeared at dawn, but they weren't coming to collect debts. Not the usual kind, anyway. Dalton Keen watched from his cracked window as 5 Apache riders approached his failing ranch. They moved with the quiet precision of a war party, but their hands were empty. No rifles, no bows. Just 5 men moving like ghosts across his dust bowl of a property. The lead rider, a woman, dismounted with a grace that didn't belong in this forgotten corner of the territory. She walked to his fence post, the one leaning so hard it looked like a tired old man, and placed something small and weathered on top of it. It was an object that made Dalton's calloused hands start to tremble. A child's leather bracelet, torn and stained with blood that had dried 15 years ago. He hadn't seen it in all that time, had forced himself to forget it even existed. But someone else hadn't forgotten. Someone had kept it, cherished it. The Apache woman stepped forward, her movements like smoke. If he blinked too hard, he thought she might just disappear. Her eyes were dark and held the kind of secrets that could burn down a man's world. "You don't remember me," she said. Her voice wasn't a question. It was a statement, delivered with the kind of authority that commanded thousands. "But I remember the wolves." Dalton's breath hitched in his throat. The wolves. The night everything went wrong. The night he did something he was sure no one else in the world knew about. She stepped closer into the pale morning light, and he saw them. 3 small white scars on her left wrist. Scars he'd made himself, in a way. Scars he had bandaged with strips torn from his own shirt, while a little girl bled and shivered in his arms. But this was no little girl. This was a woman who could make the very ground beneath his feet obey her will. "My name is Ayanna," she said, and the way she said it sounded like a verdict. "I am chief of the Redstone Apache." She paused, letting the words hang in the air like a death sentence. "And I have come to settle a debt." Dalton's heart pounded against his ribs. He knew what debt she meant. It wasn't about the wolves. It was about what happened right after. It was about the secret he'd carried for 15 years, a secret that was about to be dragged out into the sun. The leather bracelet felt heavier than a pound of stone in his hand. He turned it over, tracing the intricate beadwork. Someone had painstakingly repaired the torn leather, restitched the pattern with a steady hand. He could still smell the wood smoke from his cabin that night, still hear the desperate, terrified howling that had pulled him from his bed and into the frozen wilderness. He remembered the snow, stained crimson under the moonlight. "You were bleeding so much," he said, his voice a dry rasp, like old timber. "I thought you were going to die right there in my arms." Ayanna stood perfectly still, her dark eyes locked on his. The 4 warriors behind her were like statues on their horses, but Dalton could feel their gaze on him, hot as a blacksmith's forge. These weren't just riders. They were killers. Men who had seen war and walked away from it when others didn't. "I was 8 years old," Ayanna said, her voice flat, betraying no emotion. "My father took me to gather winter herbs by the frozen river. We didn't know the early freeze had driven the wolf pack down from the high mountains." Her fingers went to the scars on her wrist, an unconscious gesture. 3 of them backed me against the rocks. My father heard me scream, but he couldn't get to me in time. Dalton remembered it all. The sound of jaws snapping shut. The biggest wolf, a gray beast with eyes like yellow ice, lunging for the little girl's throat. He'd fired his rifle twice, maybe 3 times. The memory was a blur of smoke and fear and the coppery scent of blood. But he remembered carrying her back to his cabin, her small body so light, her blood soaking through his wool shirt, warm against his skin. "You never came back for the bracelet," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "My father forbade it," she said. "He told me owing a debt to a white man would bring a great shame upon our family. That your kind only uses debts as chains." Her jaw tightened, a flicker of old anger in her eyes. But a chief doesn't answer to the memory of any man, not even her father. A cold knot formed in Dalton's stomach. Chief. That word meant everything out here. It was a power that could move mountains, reroute rivers. An Apache chief who commanded warriors like these could negotiate with governors, could start wars, or end them. Why now? He asked, his voice shaking. After all this time, why come back now? Ayana's gaze swept over his property. She saw the sagging fence, the dead crops brittle in the fields, the cabin roof that leaked in 3 different places. Her eyes took in every single detail of his poverty, his failure, his isolation. When she looked back at him, there was something new in her expression, something sharp and dangerous. Because I heard what they're planning to do to you, Dalton Keen. Her voice was low, intense. And I've come to collect what I'm owed. Before Dalton could ask what she meant, a new sound echoed across the valley. The sound of more horses, coming fast. He turned toward the main road, and his blood ran cold. 5 riders, kicking up a cloud of dust. And he recognized the man in the lead. It was Marshal Voss, and he wasn't paying a social call. Marshal Voss rode like a man who enjoyed delivering bad news. His badge glinted in the morning sun, a cold, hard piece of metal. But it wasn't the marshal that worried Dalton. It was the men behind him. They weren't deputies. Dalton knew them all. Clayton Banks from the land office, a man whose smile never reached his eyes. Silas Ward, a vulture in a fine suit who held the deeds to half the county. And 2 hired guns, big men with dead eyes, whose only job was to make sure men like Dalton didn't argue. "Keen!" Voss called out, pulling his horse to a stop 20 feet away. His eyes flickered over Ayana and her warriors, a hint of unease in his expression. "Didn't figure you for the entertaining type." Dalton stepped forward, putting himself between the lawman and the Apache chief. It was a foolish gesture, he knew. He was one broken man against the law and a rich man's muscle. "What do you want, Voss?" "Same thing I wanted last week, Keen, and the week before that." Voss swung down from his horse, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol in a way that was meant to look casual but wasn't. Silas Ward nudged his horse forward. He was a thin man, but he had the eyes of a predator. 3 months overdue, Keen. 3 months of your pathetic excuses and empty promises. He pulled a folded paper from his coat pocket. "This here is a writ of seizure. As of this morning, everything on this sorry patch of dirt becomes the property of Ward Holdings." The words hit Dalton like a punch to the gut. 3 months. It felt like a lifetime. A lifetime since the drought had turned his pasture to dust and killed his cattle. A lifetime since the bank had called in his loans. A lifetime since his neighbors started crossing the street just to avoid looking at him. A man could fall a long way in this territory, but he'd fallen faster than most. "Just give me 1 more week," Dalton said, and he hated the desperation he heard in his own voice. "I've got a buyer interested. He's coming from—" "No more weeks," Ward snapped, his voice sharp and final. "No more buyers. You're done, Keen. Pack a bag and get off my land before I have you thrown off." That's when Ayana moved. It was just a single step, a small shift of her weight, but the effect was electric. Her 4 warriors straightened in their saddles, their hands moving near their weapons. The air, which had been still and quiet, suddenly crackled with a dangerous energy. Marshal Voss's hand tightened on his gun. "Gentlemen," Ayana said, and her voice cut through the tension like a razor. "I believe there has been a misunderstanding." Ward's face, which had been smug, turned pale. He sneered at her. "This is a private matter. White man's business. It doesn't concern you, woman." "My business," Ayana said, her voice dropping to a deadly quiet, "is whatever I say it is." She walked to her horse, and from a saddlebag she withdrew a heavy leather pouch. It clinked with the sound of coins. Real coins. When she turned back to face Ward, her expression was as hard as granite. "How much does he owe you?" Ward licked his dry lips, his eyes darting between Ayanna and the marshal. $800, plus interest. But it doesn't matter. The contract's been breached. The land is forfeit. It's the law. Ayanna opened the pouch. Inside, gleaming in the sun, were gold pieces. Double eagles. Not paper money, not promises. The kind of wealth that could buy a man's silence, his loyalty, or his entire future. She began to count them out, her fingers moving with precision. One by one, the gold coins dropped into her palm. The sight of it made Ward's eyes go wide, but as she finished counting, Dalton realized something that made his stomach drop. She wasn't counting out the money for Ward. The gold wasn't to pay his debt. It was for something else, something that was about to turn this whole situation upside down. Ayanna walked not to Ward, but to Dalton's broken-down fence. With a few powerful strikes, she drove a wooden stake deep into the dry earth. Then she untied a strip of bright red cloth from her saddle and tied it to the post. It snapped and fluttered in the wind like a battle flag. "This land," she announced, her voice ringing out across the valley, clear and strong, "is now under the protection of the Redstone Apache. Any man who sets foot on it without permission will answer to me." Ward's face went from pale to a deep, blotchy crimson. He sputtered, "You can't do this. You can't just claim a white man's land. There are laws, there are treaties." "The Treaty of Broken Hills," Ayanna said, her voice calm and steady as a rock. "Article 7, Section 3. It states that any Apache tribe retains the sovereign right to grant sanctuary and protection to any person who has provided critical aid to a member of the tribe." From another saddlebag, she produced a rolled document, tied with a leather cord. When she unrolled it, Dalton could see official seals, gleaming under the sun. "I hold the authority, granted by that treaty and recognized by the territorial government, to extend tribal protection to this property and to its owner." Marshal Voss took the document from her, his hands shaking slightly. Dalton watched the color drain from the lawman's face as he read. Out here, treaties weren't just suggestions. They were ironclad laws, backed by the full power of the federal government. To break one was to risk bringing down the wrath of the territorial governor himself. "This is ridiculous," Ward snapped, his voice high and strained. "What aid? When did this washed-up rancher ever help your people?" Ayanna reached up and untied a leather cord from around her neck. Hanging from it was a small, intricately carved wolf's tooth. "15 years ago, Dalton Keen saved my life," she said, her voice ringing with conviction. "He fought off 3 grown wolves when they had me cornered. He carried me 7 miles through a blizzard to his cabin and tended my wounds." She held up her left wrist, displaying the 3 pale scars for all to see. "These marks are my proof. His act of honor is the foundation of my claim." "A child's story," Ward scoffed, trying to regain his composure. "You expect us to give up a legal foreclosure based on some sentimental tale from 15 years ago?" "I don't expect you to believe a story," Ayanna said, her voice turning to ice. "I expect you to believe federal law." She swung herself up onto her horse in one fluid, powerful motion. "Mr. Keen's debt is hereby assumed by the Redstone Apache. We will settle the account with you, Mr. Ward, in our own time, and in our own way." Ward's confidence finally shattered. He could bully a broken-down rancher, but this was different. Dealing with an Apache tribe that controlled major trade routes and had the ear of officials in the capital, that was a game he wasn't prepared for. "You can't just ride in here and change the rules," he stammered, but the fight had gone out of his voice. Ayanna looked down at him from her horse, her expression a mixture of pity and contempt. "Mr. Ward, my people have been trading across this territory for 100 years. We know which merchants are honorable, and we know which ones grow rich by preying on desperate men." A slow, sharp smile spread across her face. "Perhaps it's time the other ranchers and business owners learned what we know." The threat was unspoken, but devastating. Ward's entire empire was built on reputation and credit. A single word from the chief of the Redstone Apache, a whisper of his predatory lending practices, could poison every well, sever every business relationship he had. He would be ruined. "This isn't over," Ward muttered, yanking his horse's reins and turning to leave. "No," Ayanna agreed softly as he rode away, his hired guns trailing behind him like spooked coyotes. "It isn't." As they disappeared over the rise, Dalton felt like the world had tilted on its axis. Everything he thought he knew about his life, his failures, his lonely place in this world, was suddenly wrong. But the look on Ayanna's face told him this was far from over. She dismounted and walked to his cabin door, and suddenly the powerful chief was gone, replaced by a woman with a haunted look in her eyes. "There's something else, Dalton," she said, her hand going to the wolf tooth at her neck. "Something I never told anyone about that night. The night you saved me." She took a deep breath. "You weren't the only other person in those woods." Dalton's hand froze on the handle of his cabin door. "What do you mean? Not alone?" Ayanna's warriors had dismounted and were now making a small, efficient camp near the creek bed. They moved with a quiet purpose that told Dalton this wasn't just a symbolic gesture. They were here to stay. This was real protection. "My brother was with me that night," Ayanna said, her voice barely a whisper. "Dakota. He was 10 years old. He was slow, gentle. He wouldn't have hurt a fly." She paused, the memory twisting her face in pain. "The wolves came for him first." The word struck Dalton like a physical blow. He staggered back and sank onto his porch steps, the world spinning. Memories he had buried deep, memories he had convinced himself were just part of the nightmare, came flooding back. The snow, the blood. There had been 2 children. Dear God, how could he have forgotten? He remembered now. The boy was already gone when he'd gotten there, his small body still and broken in the snow. He had focused on the girl, on the one who was still breathing, the one he might be able to save. "I tried to pull him away," Ayanna continued, her voice hollow and distant. "That's when they turned on me. By the time your rifle fired, he was already gone." "I'm sorry," Dalton whispered, the words feeling useless and small. "I should have been faster. I should have—" "You saved one child that night when you could have just walked away," Ayanna interrupted, sitting beside him on the dusty steps. Most men would have heard screaming in the woods and barred their door, decided it wasn't their fight. Dalton looked at her, really looked at her, and for a moment he saw past the powerful chief to the terrified 8-year-old girl who had watched her brother die in the most horrific way imaginable. "How did you become chief?" he asked, needing to change the subject. "Your father. He said owing me a debt would bring shame." "My father died of a fever 3 winters after that night," she said, a hard edge returning to her voice. "The shame he spoke of died with him. I spent the next 10 years learning. I learned your laws, your treaties, your trade agreements. I learned that knowledge was a weapon more powerful than any rifle." She stood up and walked towards the small fire her warriors had built. "When the old chief passed without a son, the council argued for months. They said a woman could not lead, could not negotiate with the white men in the capital." She let out a short, bitter laugh. "So I rode to the capital myself. I used their own laws to negotiate a trade deal that brought more wealth and security to our people than any chief had in a generation." After that, the council was silent. Dalton watched her, saw the way her warriors looked at her. It wasn't just loyalty, it was reverence, respect that had been earned in blood, sweat, and shrewd negotiation. "And now you're here," he said. "Now I'm here," she agreed. "Because 15 years ago, a forgotten rancher who had nothing taught me that a person's honor isn't about their blood or their name. It's about the choices they make when nobody is watching. Just then, one of her warriors approached and spoke to her in their native tongue, his voice low and urgent. As he spoke, Ayana's expression grew dark. When he finished, she turned back to Dalton, her eyes like gathering storm clouds. "Ward didn't ride for home," she said. "He rode for town, straight for the telegraph office. He's calling in his powerful friends, contacting the territorial marshal." A cold dread seeped into Dalton's bones. A territorial marshal had authority over everyone, local lawmen, treaties, everything. If Ward could twist the story, paint Ayana as an aggressor, claim she was threatening settlers. "How long do we have?" he asked. Ayana stared at the horizon, at the faint dust cloud that marked Ward's desperate ride. Maybe 2 days. Maybe less. She met his gaze, and for the first time, he saw a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. "But there's something else, something Ward is counting on that he thinks we don't know." She walked back to her saddle and pulled out a rolled map, its edges soft and frayed from years of use. She spread it out on his porch, weighing the corners with stones. "Your land," she said, tracing a faint line with her finger, "sits directly on the old winter trail. For 300 years my people used this route to travel to the sacred burial grounds in the northern mountains." Dalton looked at the map. His small, insignificant ranch was marked with a precise X. "So he's not just after the land for the debt." "The debt is an excuse," Ayana said, her voice grim. "The territorial government is planning to run a railroad through this valley. They need a clear, uncomplicated path, no tribal claims, no treaty disputes." The pieces clicked into place in Dalton's mind with sickening clarity. Ward's desperate push to foreclose on such a small debt, the hired guns, the impossible timeline. "He thinks if he owns your land, he controls the route," Ayana continued. "He can sell it to the railroad for a fortune, but the burial grounds are protected by federal law. The railroad can't touch them without renegotiating every treaty in this territory. Unless there's no one left to object," Dalton finished, a grim understanding dawning on him. "Exactly. Drive out the ranchers, buy the land for pennies on the dollar, and present the railroad with a clean, simple deal." Ayana rolled up the map. "Ward has been doing this for 2 years, across 3 counties. Your ranch, Dalton, is the last piece of the puzzle." A hot anger, an emotion he hadn't felt in years, began to burn in Dalton's chest. It wasn't just at Ward, it was at himself, for his own blindness. He had thought his failure was his own fault, a personal shame. But he hadn't just failed. He had been targeted, systematically dismantled by a man who saw him as nothing more than a stone in his path. "Why didn't you tell me this from the start?" he asked. "Because knowing you're being hunted without having a weapon is just another kind of prison," Ayana said, swinging back onto her horse. "But now you have weapons. You have the protection of my tribe. You have the backing of federal treaties." She paused, a strange glint in her eye. "And you have something that Ward never, ever saw coming." "What's that?" "A witness," she said. But before she could explain, the sound of hoofbeats echoed from the main road again. It wasn't the heavy tread of the marshal's men. It was a single rider, coming at a full gallop, riding as if the devil himself was on his heels. A young Apache brave crested the hill, his horse slick with sweat. He reined in sharply, shouting to Ayana in their native tongue, his words a torrent of urgent warning. As he spoke, Ayana's face hardened into a mask of grim resolve. When he was finished, she turned to Dalton, her eyes as cold and dark as a winter storm. "Ward didn't go to the telegraph office," she said, her voice tight with suppressed fury. "That was a feint. He went to Fort Collins. He's met with Colonel Brennan. He's convinced the cavalry that we are in violation of territorial boundaries, that we are a hostile force threatening white settlers." Dalton's blood ran cold. Fort Collins meant the U.S. cavalry. It meant federal troops who could override any treaty, any tribal protection Ayanna could offer. They wouldn't care about a 15-year-old debt or a strip of red cloth on a fence post. They would come with guns and bugles, and they would do whatever Colonel Brennan told them to do. "How many?" he asked, his throat dry. "2 companies, 60, maybe 70 men," Ayanna said. Her voice was steady, but Dalton could see the frantic calculations happening behind her eyes. "They'll be here by tomorrow afternoon." One of her warriors stepped forward, speaking to her in a low, quiet voice. Ayanna listened, her expression unreadable, then shook her head with a sharp, decisive motion. "What did he say?" Dalton asked. "He suggested we withdraw before the cavalry arrives," Ayanna said, her jaw tight. "That we leave you to your fate." A bitter smile touched her lips. "I told him that is not how a debt of honor is paid." She looked towards the horizon, towards the unseen threat that was now riding towards them. "But he is right about one thing. 4 warriors and a piece of paper won't be enough to stop a cavalry charge." "Then what do we need?" Dalton asked, feeling a strange sense of calm settle over him. The fear was gone, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. "We need a different kind of army," Ayanna said, and for the first time since she arrived, a genuine smile touched her lips. It wasn't the calculated expression of a chief, but the fierce, determined grin of a survivor who had learned to turn her enemies' strengths into weapons against them. "We need to make sure that when Colonel Brennan arrives, he doesn't find a lone rancher and a few Apache warriors. He finds the truth." But as she spoke, another rider appeared on the horizon. This one was far in the distance, a small speck moving fast. He wore the blue uniform of a cavalry scout, and he was riding hard, not towards them, but back towards Fort Collins, carrying a message that was about to change everything. Ayanna acted instantly. She called to her fastest rider, a young man named Cale. Within moments, he was mounted on a fresh horse, a sealed leather pouch in his hand. "These are letters," she explained to Dalton, her voice sharp and focused, "from 3 territorial judges who have been investigating Silas Ward's land purchases for the last 6 months. They contain evidence, forged documents, sworn affidavits from intimidated witnesses, proof that he has been making false claims to tribal territories for years." Dalton stared at her, stunned. "You've been planning this for weeks." "Months," she corrected, checking the action on her rifle with practiced ease. "Your ranch wasn't the first one Ward tried to steal, Dalton, but I made a promise to the spirits of my ancestors that it would be the last." As the sun climbed higher in the sky, a strange thing began to happen. More riders appeared on the horizon, not from the north, where the cavalry was massing, but from the east and west. They weren't soldiers or lawmen. They were ranchers, settlers, townspeople, men with worn faces and calloused hands, all riding towards Dalton's property with a grim, silent determination. "Who are they?" Dalton asked, his voice filled with disbelief. One of Ayanna's warriors lowered a spyglass. "It looks like half the county," he said. "The men Ward has cheated, the families he has driven from their homes, the merchants whose businesses he has destroyed." Thomas McCarty was the first to arrive. His face was a road map of hardship, carved by years of failed crops and broken promises. "Keen," he called out, dismounting from his tired old horse. "Heard Ward was finally making his move on you." "News travels fast," Dalton said, still trying to process the scene unfolding before him. "Fast enough," McCarty spat into the dust. "That damn snake stole my water rights 2 years back, produced papers I never signed, claimed I owed money I never borrowed." He looked at Ayanna, his expression a mixture of suspicion and grudging respect. "The lady here sent word, said there might finally be a reckoning." More and more men arrived. Samuel Brooks, the miller who'd lost everything to one of Ward's manufactured debts. Ezra Tate, whose family cattle ranch had been seized on a trumped-up violation of a law that didn't even exist. Every man carried a rifle, and every man wore the hard, unyielding expression of someone who had been pushed too far and had nothing left to lose. "This isn't your fight," Dalton told them, overwhelmed. "The hell it isn't," Brooks shot back, his voice thick with anger. "Ward's been picking us off one by one for years, using the law like a club to beat us down, but he can't beat all of us, not if we stand together." Ayanna surveyed the growing crowd. There were nearly 30 of them now, a small, ragged army of farmers and ranchers. "Colonel Brennan is a soldier, not a politician," she said, her voice carrying over the murmuring crowd. "He will think twice before ordering his men to fire on this many citizens, especially when federal judges are reviewing the legality of Ward's claims." But even as she spoke, the situation grew more complicated. New dust clouds were appearing, from 3 different directions at once. The cavalry was approaching from the north, a solid, disciplined line of blue. Ward and his hired guns were coming from the east, and from the south, a new group. A wagon train, moving with military precision. Dalton squinted against the sun's glare. "Who's that? The southern group?" Ayanna's expression tightened as she watched the approaching wagons. "Territorial Marshal Davidson and his deputies. Ward didn't just call the cavalry. He called in every favor he has." What had started as a simple foreclosure had spiraled into a massive standoff. It was the U.S. cavalry, the territorial marshals, and a wealthy land baron against one Apache chief, one broken-down rancher, and a small army of angry farmers. One gunshot, one wrong move, and the entire valley could erupt in a firestorm of violence that would be felt across the whole territory. "We're outnumbered 3-1, McCarty observed, his voice grim. "Numbers don't matter when you're on the right side of things," Brooks argued. "Being right doesn't stop bullets," Tate muttered darkly. Ayanna climbed onto Dalton's porch, raising her hand for silence. 15 years ago," she called out, her voice clear and powerful, "one man, Dalton Keen, risked his life to save a child he did not know. He asked for no reward. He expected no thanks. Today, we stand on his land. But we are not just here to protect one man. We are here to prove that honor and justice still mean something in this territory." The men listened, their faces turned up towards her, their expressions a mixture of hope and fear. "Silas Ward thinks he can take whatever he wants because he has money and paper and hired guns," she continued, her voice ringing with passion. "But papers can be proven to be lies, and hired guns only fight for the man who pays them." She pointed a finger towards the converging forces. "What he doesn't have is what we have right here, in this yard. The truth, and people willing to fight for it." But just as the different groups began to position themselves for a confrontation, a lone rider appeared from the west. He was moving slowly, deliberately. He carried a white flag of truce, and he wore the official insignia of a federal Indian agent. The final piece was on the board, and the game was about to end. The federal Indian agent rode as if he owned the valley. Agent Marcus Whitmore dismounted with a slow, deliberate ceremony, his crisp, dark suit a stark contrast to the dust and sweat of the men surrounding Dalton's ranch. He ignored the cavalry, the marshals, and the ranchers, walking directly to the porch. "Chief Ayanna," he said, his voice calm and professional. He gave a slight, respectful incline of his head. "Agent Whitmore, from the Bureau of Indian Affairs. I've come in response to the formal complaint you filed against Mr. Silas Ward." From across the field, Ward's face went white as a sheet. He spurred his horse forward, his voice cracking with panic. "Agent Whitmore, there's been a terrible misunderstanding. This woman, she has no authority to file federal complaints regarding multiple violations of treaty law." Whitmore interrupted, his voice cutting like a whip. "I'm afraid she has every authority, Mr. Ward, and her documentation, I must say, was exceptionally thorough." Colonel Brennan of the U.S. Cavalry rode up, his face a mask of stern confusion. His men were arrayed in a perfect battle line behind him. "Agent Whitmore," the colonel said, his voice a low rumble. "I was informed of Apache aggression against territorial citizens. Am I to understand that this is a hostile situation?" "The only hostility I see, Colonel," Whitmore replied, his voice dangerously calm, "stems from Mr. Ward's documented and repeated pattern of illegal land seizures." He pulled a thick folder from his saddlebag. "I have here forged deeds, falsified debt ledgers, sworn testimony from intimidated witnesses, all part of a conspiracy to defraud citizens and violate federal law regarding protected Apache treaty lands." Ward's hired guns began to back away slowly. This wasn't a simple land grab anymore. This was a federal case. Fighting desperate ranchers was one thing. Facing a federal judge was something else entirely. "Those are lies!" Ward sputtered, his face slick with sweat. "Savage propaganda designed to—" "Be careful, Mr. Ward." Ayanna's voice sliced through the air, cold as steel. "An insult directed at a tribal chief in the presence of a federal agent can be interpreted as a violation of diplomatic protocols." Colonel Brennan studied the scene. He saw the grim-faced ranchers, the disciplined Apache warriors, the federal agent with a mountain of evidence. This wasn't the simple Indian uprising Ward had described. This was something far more complicated. "Agent Whitmore," the colonel said carefully, "what exactly is the government's position here?" "Our position," Whitmore stated, his voice ringing with authority, "is to launch an immediate and full-scale investigation into Mr. Ward's business practices, starting with his conspiracy to illegally seize protected tribal burial grounds for the purpose of railroad development." His words hung in the air, a death sentence for Ward's ambitions. "Any military action taken against Chief Ayanna or the citizens currently under her legal protection," Whitmore added, looking directly at the colonel, "would be considered interference in a federal investigation." Thomas McCarty stepped forward, his rifle held loosely in his hands. "Colonel," he said, his voice steady, "we're not here looking for a fight. We're here because the law that was supposed to protect us failed. This woman, she offered us justice." "Justice?" Ward's laugh was a high, hysterical sound. "You call this mob rule, this savage intimidation, justice?" Dalton had been silent through it all, watching the pieces fall into place. But Ward's words, the venom and contempt in his voice, ignited something deep inside him. 15 years of shame, of isolation, of believing he was a failure, all of it burned away in a sudden cleansing fire. "Savage," Dalton said, stepping forward. His voice was quiet, but it carried across the tense silence of the yard. "You want to talk about savage, Silas?" He walked to the center of the yard, pulling off his worn work shirt, revealing a torso crisscrossed with the faded silvery lines of old scars. "Let me tell you about Savage." The crowd went completely silent. Even Ward's remaining men leaned forward, listening. 15 years ago, I found 2 children in the woods being torn apart by wolves," Dalton said, his voice growing stronger with every word. "One of them was already dead. The other was bleeding out in the snow. I could have turned around. I could have gone back to my warm cabin and told myself it wasn't my problem." He locked his eyes on Ward. "But I didn't. I fought 3 full-grown wolves with nothing but this." He held up his scarred hands. "And an old rifle. I carried that little girl 7 miles through a blizzard. I cleaned her wounds, and I prayed to a God I hadn't spoken to in years that she would live. I never asked for a dime. I never expected a word of thanks." Dalton looked directly at Silas Ward, his gaze burning with a righteous fury. "That little girl grew up. She grew up to be the chief of her people, the most respected leader in this territory. And when she heard that a man like you was using lies and corruption to steal my land, she came back. She came back to pay a debt of honor." Ayanna moved to stand beside him, her presence a silent testament to the truth of his words. In that moment, He wasn't a forgotten rancher anymore. He was a man standing next to a queen. "The savage in this story, Silas," Dalton said, his voice low and powerful, "isn't the woman who honored a 15-year-old promise. It's the man who built an empire on the ruins of other people's lives." Desperation made Ward reckless. His face was a mask of pure hatred. "I will not be lectured by a failed rancher and his hand blurred as it dropped towards his holster, but he never cleared the leather. A single gunshot echoed across the valley. Everything seemed to happen in slow motion. Ward's pistol, knocked from his grip, spun through the air and landed in the dust. Marshal Voss stood 20 feet away, his own pistol smoking in his hand. "That's enough, Ward," Voss said, his voice flat and tired. "You're under arrest." "On what charge?" Ward shrieked, clutching his wrist where the bullet had grazed him. "Attempted assault on a federal agent will do for a start," Agent Whitmore said calmly, motioning for his deputies to move in. "Add to that treaty violations, document fraud, and conspiracy to defraud the United States government." As the deputies put Silas Ward in shackles, his last 2 hired guns faded into the landscape like smoke. With Ward's money and power gone, their loyalty vanished with it. Colonel Brennan rode forward, addressing Ayanna not as a hostile, but as a fellow leader. "Chief Ayanna," he said, his voice filled with formal respect, "my apologies for the misunderstanding. We will be withdrawing our forces immediately." "Thank you, Colonel," Ayanna replied, her tone gracious and diplomatic. "Your dedication to protecting the citizens of this territory is commendable." She had turned a potential enemy into an ally without firing a single shot. As the cavalry and the marshals departed with their prisoner, the ranchers began to drift away as well. But before they left, each man came to Dalton. They shook his hand. They clapped him on the shoulder. They offered him help rebuilding his ranch, promises of shared labor and supplies. "Always knew you were a good man, Keen," Thomas McCarty said, his voice thick with emotion. "Just took the right kind of trouble to prove it." When the last of them had ridden off, Dalton stood alone with Ayanna and her warriors by the quiet creek. The silence was different now. It wasn't the crushing weight of loneliness. It was peace. "Your debt is paid," Dalton said quietly. "More than paid. You saved my land, my life, maybe even my soul." Ayanna shook her head. "The debt was never about saving your ranch, Dalton. It was about honoring the man you are." She gestured to his small, humble cabin. "A man who fights for others when it would be easier to walk away. A man who understands that some things are more important than money or land." She mounted her horse, but instead of turning to leave, she pulled another folded document from her saddlebag. "The territorial government owes my tribe a great deal of compensation for Ward's illegal use of our sacred lands. Part of that settlement includes the water rights for this entire valley." Dalton's heart sank. After all this, was he still going to lose everything? "I'm deeding those water rights to you," Ayanna said, a small smile playing on her lips. "Along with a 5-year contract to supply the Redstone Reservation with horses. You'll have a steady income, Dalton, and you'll have the respect of every man in this county." The world had been turned right side up again. The forgotten rancher, the man who had hit rock bottom, now stood as a respected partner to the most powerful tribal leader in the region. His long, painful isolation was over, not because of anything he had done for himself, but because of a single act of kindness he had shown to a child in a snowstorm 15 years ago. "Why?" he asked, his voice choked with emotion. "You could have any rancher in the territory as your partner." Ayanna smiled, and for just a second, the powerful chief vanished, and he saw the 8-year-old girl with fear in her eyes and blood on her clothes. "Because honor recognizes honor, Dalton Keen," she said softly. "And because some debts are too important to ever be fully repaid. They can only be honored, again and again." She turned her horse, and with her warriors falling into formation behind her, rode away. Dalton stood in front of his cabin, watching them go. It was no longer a broken-down shack. It was his home. The red cloth, the symbol of her protection, still snapped in the wind, a bright flag marking his land, his future, and his place in the world. A place he had earned by doing the simplest and hardest thing a man can do, helping someone else when no one was watching. The forgotten rancher had finally been remembered. If you enjoyed this story of justice on the frontier, click the video on your screen now for another unforgettable tale where courage and destiny collide. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell. Your support allows us to keep finding and telling these incredible stories, and we truly appreciate every single one of you.